Here we go. All right, our Torah portion is Vayikra, which means and called. And rather than just isolating it to the Torah portion itself, last night what I tried to give everybody was an overview of the book itself, showing the different functions of the book and the three things it addresses, basically the structure of it. And then, of course, we went and we looked. We wanted to do our little exercise where, okay, I'm reading in the New Testament. I'd like some better context for what I'm reading. I'd like to go back to the Torah and put it in that context. And so our context for last night was 1 Peter, but you can also do it with 2 Peter. Both of the letters of Peter very much incorporate the themes of the book of Vayikra. So I gave you these examples of parallel texts or parallel themes, but your homework, which is going to be the last 2 slides, you're going to take the second, I think it's a second letter, second chapter. I'll have to look and see. I've pulled out a chapter, and then I have around 10 questions for you for homework to take the lessons of the Torah portion and see if you can apply them in Peter's letter. And that way it'll help you make that stronger connection to the themes of Vayikra. So we have the parallel themes of being holy because the Holy One is holy. We have the parallel themes of sin offerings or sin sacrifices and how suffering factors into that. We used a sample passage on not taking vengeance, those parallel texts, understanding that the reason for it is so that you may inherit a blessing. And then the last one had to do with perfection, how living this life of holiness, it perfects, confirms, strengthens, and establishes us. Okay. We talked about how the role of the priest is different from the prophet or the king. If you think in terms of the prophet, there seems to be a sort of a shelf life for the prophet. He is very much a commentator on history, and the king is very much a person who makes history, because through his method of ruling, he's going to make the history, or at least he thinks he is. We all know that it's under a divine, I don't want to call it a machine, but it's all under divine control and a divine timetable. But the king's decisions do influence how history is recorded and how it unfolds. The prophet is going to be a commentator on this history. But the priest is different. And his role really isn't dependent on history, even though we could say, well, there's no Mishkan, there's no Mikdash, if there's no temple, then of course the role of the priest is different. But not really, because number one, his position is genetic. It's handed down through the family. And even if there is no Mikdash, even in the synagogue today, the Leviim and the Kohanim are given special roles. There's special things that they will do in the synagogue, such as give the Aaronic benediction. They still have the special rules of marriage that apply to them, if they choose to obey them. And we're going to look at the 2 different types of priesthood. We're going to look at the Levitical priesthood, but as a kingdom of priests, Israel were appointed to be priests to the world. And so that role is unchanging. That role has not changed. From its inception, that role of a kingdom of priests has not changed. So relative to the prophet or the king, the role of the priest really does not depend upon history. It exists within history. And it ritualistically, because Vayikra is a very ritualistic book, very ritualistically, the priest will function in that capacity, such as there's a difference between things that apply directly to temple service and things that apply in your home. If you're a kingdom of priests, then say the laws of Nidah, the laws of separation during menstruation. If your family is a living priesthood, then they will obey and observe those laws of separation within the home that the rest of the world may not even be aware of those. But the priest is aware, and the priest ritualistically obeys. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And so, the priesthood role, the danger there is for things to become rote, for us to simply perform things because we've always done them that way and not to question why. And so we need that element of the prophet to constantly provoke us and make us examine ourselves as to whether these particular sacrifices that we make, these particular acts of obedience, whether they're coming from the heart, whether they're acts of love, or they're nothing but ritual, that they're devoid of any heart change or transformation. But ironically, even though modern society pretty much despises anything ritualistic, unless it's watching football on Sunday or watching basketball in March, when it has to do with things of faith, even the churches have come to mock or scorn ritual. But the heart of the Torah is found in ritual. It's found in the laws of the priesthood, the Torah Kohanim. So there is something about ritual that human beings do need. The way that we were designed, the way that we were created, there is an element of ritualism that we need to be able to function in peace, not just with ourselves, but with one another. Because remember, this is where we first read the commandment to love your neighbor as yourself. That's found in Vayikra. That's part of the call. And here's our structure that we're working with. And this is why we wanted to lay that foundation a few weeks ago about the construction of the Mishkan being a parallel structure to the creation days described in Genesis 1, because there was a garden priesthood that had to guard these separations. The creation comes to be in a series of separations, separating the darkness from the light, separating the waters from the waters, separating the dry earth from the sea, separating the trees according to their kinds of seeds, separating the beasts according to their kinds. And so a garden priesthood had to be on duty at all times to guard those boundaries and to maintain those things so they would not mix. So there would be no confusion that within the separations there was life. And that's the thing to remember about the Levitical priesthood. They needed to maintain separations within Israel in order to maintain life. It's the same thing with us as a nation of priests. As the Levitical priesthood is to Israel, so Israel is to the world. And it's their job, it's their calling, and you see that progression there. We've gone from a garden priesthood in Bereshit, paradise gained and lost. And then in Shemot, Exodus, we're called a nation of priests and a holy nation. And then now we've arrived at Vayikra, and we are here to learn about our calling. So we would expect to learn things about our garden priesthood, which is the priesthood that we will return to. But we also need to know the Levitical laws, as well as the laws of being a holy nation. So you will find your vocation in Vayikra. You will find your job description. Basically, if we want to parallel it with something practical, if you start a new job, if you start a new vocation, then you need the manual for how to run the machines, how to run the office, so that the whole thing doesn't fall into confusion. And we went into some detail about how the three parts of Vayikra function together. How we can come close to God through sacrifices in the holy sanctuary, how we must learn the difference and the boundaries between what is holy within the tribes of Israel versus what is out in the world. And then once those boundaries are established and accepted, then we learn how to take the holy into the world without allowing the uncleanness, the impurities of the world to seep into us, rather than having the positive effect of purity seeping into the world from us. But if we're going to maintain the boundary between the holy and the rest of the world, that takes study, that takes sacrifice. And it involves both studying the sacrifices of the holy sanctuary, as well as instructions about how do I get into this world without becoming polluted by it. And First Peter alludes to this. He says, you're a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, so that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. So that word there for called is going to be in the Greek 2564. We're going to take a closer look at Vayikra as it relates to this Greek word 2564. They're cognates, Hebrew and Greek. And at this point, I'm going to stop sharing this and I'm going to share something else. I'm going to show you how to do something so you'll know how to do your homework. All right, if you don't already have a Bible application that you already know how to use well, I'm going to show you one of the easiest ones I've ever found. It's online, it's free. And you can pick up here at the top of the bar where it says NASB. You can pick any of these versions. I would stick with either New King James or NASB, simply because the continuity of the words and not getting confused in terms of translations. These have pretty good literal translations. Nothing's perfect, but this is one way. So you can also see up here at the top of this toolbar, right now I've got paragraph checked in green. And what's that do? It's going to give me the whole text, which, by the way, our psalm this week is Psalm 50. So I pulled up Psalm 50 so that you can see the kara, the calling that is within Vayikra. Vayikra, you're being called. You're being called into a vocation of priesthood. And so I go to the psalm for the week, and I can see that reiterated within the psalm. But I want to break it down by verse because I might have to do homework. And so I click on verse. Okay, you see how that separates those out by verse? And you'll see over here on the left, each one has a tool button, right? So let's say your homework was read the psalm, and in the first verse, find the word that corresponds to the name of the Torah portion. And you look at it and you say, well, I don't see and called. I don't even see called. But I've got a pretty good hunch on this. So what do? I go over here to the tools next to it and see how it pops up different things I can do. I can read it in different Bibles, where another translation, it'll list all the translations, which I'll show you that. Okay, see all the different translations? Okay, I skim through there. I don't really see the word I'm looking for, but if I can read the Hebrew, there's my cheat sheet right there. It's in the Hebrew, so I'm going to flip back up where you can't see that. Right? So, okay, I don't really see Vayikra. Let me try this. What if I do interlinear? Right, so if you pull up interlinear, if you can read the Hebrew, then you see it right there, Vayikra. Right, But I can also scan down through here. So let me go through. It'll have a transliteration, and there it is, kara, right? And so I can go over here and I can click on the H, and there's my root word, kara. Right? Now, it won't do this, I don't think, on the Hebrew side. It might. But if you do this in the Greek, if I were to give you, which is, your homework is in 1 Peter, if you were to do that same thing in the Greek, if you click and you expand these things down here that will take you into the Strong's definitions and the Gesenius lexicon, then as you scroll down through there, if it's describing, if you just keep scrolling, eventually, most likely, it will give you the Hebrew cognate word to that particular word. Right, so I did want to show you that. And you can do other things with it as well. But I wanted you to at least have one tool that was easy to use if you don't have a Bible software application. Right. So we'll get back to the PowerPoint now. But I wanted you to have something to refer to once you get to your homework, where I am asking you to say, okay, here's this Greek word. What is its cognate in Hebrew? If you go through that process, you'll find it. Oops. Share. Here we go. All right, so if you were to do that same process with G2564 that Peter's talking about, him who has called you, that's what you will actually find if you keep scrolling down through there, is that its cognate in Hebrew is kara. Right? And then Peter even mentions something that would take us back to the garden priesthood or to the creation priesthood, because he refers to being called out of darkness into his marvelous light. So that makes us think of the creation Mishkan. So it's still part of our progression, a garden priesthood, a nation of priests, and eventually a smaller group of Levitical priests who function as priests to the priesthood. 12:49 p.m. Okay, I didn't know that would do that. At any rate, he's using the calling of Vayikra to bring to mind the sacrifices. Right? So we're going to go through here. Let's look at the definition again of how kara in Vayikra is used. Now, in its simple form, it just means you called somebody to do something. And remember last year when we did this Torah portion, and like I say, I still have the audio of that. If you don't have it anymore and you'd like to go back through it, it's like a companion to this lesson in terms of the humbling of oneself. That is absolutely required if you're going to engage this particular book of the Torah. But what you'll see in 1 Peter in that letter is that he's going to use that Greek word for kara 6 times, which should make you think of this particular book of the Torah, Vayikra. And even though now the English word is so secularized, in times past, it had a really deep religious meaning. And kara, it meant a task to which one is called. It was like a vocation. Our English word came through Latin and Old French. So if we take it back to where it first started evolving out of kara, it meant like your life calling. This is what you're supposed to do in life. So as you're approaching the book of Vayikra, again, it's like your vocational manual. It's your handbook for the job. And it's considered a sacred task or mission. Originally, this vocation, it was a sacred mission. It wasn't just any job or just any vocation or calling. It was the vocation of your faith. And here's what Rabbi Sachs said about the book of Vayikra as a vocational manual. He says, what I am about to tell you is not only about what you should do, it's also about what you are called to be. The idea being that it's about Israel's call to a vocation as a holy people completely dedicated to God. If you're an engineer, if you are an architect, if you're a personal assistant, if you work in a factory, those are only secondary as your vocations. Your primary vocation is as a holy people completely dedicated to God. You are a kingdom of priests to the world. That's your primary job. Your primary vocation is not to go out and earn a living for your family. Now, you can incorporate the two things. That can be, remember, not just what you do, but on who you are, what you're called to be. So in engaging that secondary vocation, which is a secular job, you can incorporate that holiness of the priesthood into that job so that even in doing that secular job, it's completely dedicated to the kingdom itself because you are its priest. If the priests don't go to work, there's no temple service. It's the same thing with the kingdom of priests. If we don't get up and go to work every day and understand what our primary vocation is, then the world will devolve into chaos and Hamas. Remember, that was the gripe leveled against the priests by the prophets, is that they didn't teach the difference between the holy and the profane to the people, and therefore they had done Hamas, or violence, to the word. And there was a period in history where there was so little priesthood in the world that it ended up with a worldwide flood because so much Hamas proliferated. When nobody's there to tell you what is right, what is wrong, what is true, what is a lie, what is holy, what is profane, then confusion sets in. Your vocation is to maintain boundaries so that people never know, never can forget the difference between what is sin and what isn't. Because our natural human tendency is to blur the lines, like the knowledge of good and evil, to put all that together. It's our vocation to separate it out and to never let people forget there is a separation, either because we say it or because we live it, because it's who we are. And if you remember, there was a small aleph in Vayikra in the Hebrew text that the rabbis say alludes to Moshe's humility, which he's actually imitating the Holy One in that. And you say, well, how can Adonai be humble? He actually is humble. By making himself accessible to creations like us, he is exercising an attribute of humility, because in his greatness, we can see what happens when you get close to him and you're not worthy. When you simply aren't prepared for that level of holiness, and the absolute energy of it will break out on you like Nadav and Avihu. So to even let him be near him, and even let us be near him, is a kind of humility. He's making himself more accessible and smaller than the infinity and the greatness that he actually is. So here's a picture, if you'll remember, from last year, and you can see the tiny aleph and how it would be easy to misread it as Vayikar, which is actually a term of enmity, which means it's like happened upon. There's chance. And see, so many in the world today think the world is nothing but chance. But Torah teaches you that if you want to believe in chance, then chance will happen to you, as was, in many cases. People who want to believe that we're evolved from monkeys or apes or whatever, their behavior and their ultimate end, they will get exactly what they want. But if it's Vayikra, it's a call of love. If it's Vayikar, it's a call of enmity. So by its nature, the first word of Vayikra, if you engage in your vocation as a priest out of love, then you can expect good things are going to follow. If, however, you think it's all happenstance, then you're going to create a relationship of enmity. In fact, the more you read it, the more guilty you're going to become because you reject it. So again, without the humility, without making yourself small, like the Aleph, Yeshua says, I'm the Aleph and the Tav. He is this representation of the Father who can make himself smaller so that we can engage him without dying. And basically, without this sort of humility, the entire sacrificial system would be nothing more than a love bribe. If we'll give this many goats and bulls and sheep and doves and pounds of grain offerings, then God will love me. That's not how that system was set up at all. That small aleph, it makes you think of the first word of the 10 words, the 10 commandments. And instead of saying ani, he says anochi, anochi. And the first letter of anochi, or I, is the aleph. He says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And so he's telling you of his greatness, but then as we come to Vayikra, he makes the aleph small and he says, okay, I'm going to put it in terms you can understand. I'm actually going to be modest, right? You have known me as a terror. I've frightened you with my words. You have seen my mighty miracles. You have seen my strong arm. But he says, I'm going to make myself smaller so that we can relate to one another. And see, we have to be holy because he is holy. And so sometimes we know way more than other people, but you need to downsize so that they can understand you. You may have more things than other people. You know what? When you're with other people, downsize. Don't brag about your wealth. Don't take pride in how much you have. Be modest and meet them where they are, what they can accommodate at the time, without feeling that the entire relationship is out of reach. And that's what Rabbi Kahn says. He says, when a man becomes intoxicated with his own sense of importance, he begins to believe that he is a self-made man and begins to worship his creator, and such a man cannot find God. So the key to engaging your vocational manual of Vayikra is make yourself small. You're taught that in the first word. Think of a Mishkan service, it's definitely breaking things apart into tiny pieces so that human beings can engage them without this experience of the Exodus where they're absolutely terrified by the presence. And this is also in 1 Peter 3:4. It says your adornment must not be merely external, braiding the hair, wearing gold, putting on dresses, but let it be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is precious in the sight of God. So it's being gentle and quiet that's going to be the keys that unlock this priestly manual. And people have difficulty with that. We have so many ways now of distracting ourselves and of not being of a quiet spirit, that what is going to erupt out of that? See, if there is a lack of quietness in our spirit, if instead there is a busyness in our spirit, what we're really going to have to guard against is pride. and downsizing, because the more opportunities we have, then the more opportunities we have to become proud and to forget to make ourselves small in order to function as a priesthood. And so the point here is that without this humility of the small aleph, then even engaging in the sacrificial system, even however we keep the mitzvot today, it can become nothing more than a love bribe. In other words, if I do these things, then the Father will love me. Or if I do these things, then I've taken care of the obligation of repentance. When actually in your heart, you weren't truly repentant, you just didn't want to get killed. So you cannot misuse the commandments or the sacrifices as a love bribe. That's a misuse, it's a misapplication, it's a misunderstanding of the sacrificial system. It's a misunderstanding of the laws, the feasts, the Shabbat, the tent of meeting, all of these things. And it is possible to misuse them. Because in Amos 5:21, we read, I hate, and remember, this is coming from the perspective of the prophet. Amos is a prophet reflecting upon the history of his day. So the priests are still doing their job. Remember, they're ritualistic. They keep doing things. But it's the job of the prophet to challenge you and say, why are you doing these rituals? There is a priest in you, there is a prophet in you, and there is a king or a queen in you. And they all work together in the text. It says, I hate, I reject your festivals, nor do I delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer up to me burnt offerings and your grain offerings, I will not accept them. And I will not even look at the peace offerings of your fatlings. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I will not even listen to the sound of your harps. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. So, yes, they're checking off all the boxes. But at the very same time, they're not really doing justice and righteousness. They're simply going through this sacrificial system. They're simply going through the laws of Shabbat, and they're doing it in a rote manner. They're in history, but the heart of the prophet says, what am I doing in this history? How am I making myself small? How am I following this priestly manual as an individual? Just because there is a Levitical priesthood willing to offer your sacrifices, it doesn't mean that they can see inside your heart. Whether you are just checking off boxes or whether you are doing it to look good in front of your community, whatever that reason might be. Isaiah is another prophet who's going to challenge this system, the abuse of it. In Isaiah 1:11, he says, what are your multiplied sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings and rams and the fat of fed cattle, and I take no pleasure in the blood of bulls, lambs, or goats. When you come to appear before me, who requires of you this trampling of my courts? Bring your worthless offerings no longer. Incense is an abomination to me. New moon and Sabbath, the calling of assemblies. I cannot endure iniquity and the solemn assembly. See how those two things are put together there? You're trying to do your solemn assemblies and bring your sacrifices at the very same time that there is iniquity in you. In other words, you're not using this process to deal with the iniquity. You're doing the process alongside your iniquity and your sin. He says, I can't endure that. That's not what it's for. You're misunderstanding. He says, I hate your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. So when you spread out your hands in prayer, I will hide my eyes from you. Yes, even though you multiply prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are covered with blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your deeds from my sight. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. seek justice, reprove the ruthless, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. This sacrificial system was supposed to function alongside what he's saying in this last couple of sentences about washing yourselves and making yourselves clean, ceasing to do evil, learning to do good. They're not to replace those things. And the sacrifices we can see from this, and there's actually, if you read Psalm 50, it'll give you the exact same message. That these sacrifices could never earn anything because they weren't yours to begin with. You know what? You don't own anything. It's an illusion to think you own anything. What does it say? He owns the cattle on the 1,000 hills. What are we going to give to him as a sacrifice? The comparison that I read in one of the commentaries is like if a father gives his child a coin. And the child loves the father so much, the child wants to give the father a gift back, a token of affection. But the child doesn't own anything. All he has is the coin that his father gave him. So he gives the coin back to the father, which came from the father to begin with. And that's what these sacrifices are. It's not our lamb that we give back to the Father. It's not our grain offering that we give back to the Father. These things already belong to him. But as an act of affection, as an act of endearment, as an act of wanting to come close, korban, that's the word for the sacrifices. It means to draw close. In order to get closer to the Father, we give back to him what is already his. And this is written in 1 Chronicles 29:14. He says, "But who am I and who are my people that we should be able to offer as generously as this? For all things come from you, and from your hand we have given you." In other words, we took it out of your hand and then we handed it right back to you. And so, yeah, you may have 100 sheep in your pasture, but those are in his hand. And you're going to have to take out of his hand in order to give back to him. Hebrews 10:11 reminds us of this. It's already written for us in the Tanakh, but it's something, remember, that the prophet needs to do constantly, is to provoke us and to cause us to ask ourselves, why am I doing this? Why am I keeping this commandment? Why am I keeping this Shabbat? Why am I making this sacrifice? Why am I giving of my money into the ministry? Why am I doing this? Am I making a love bribe to the Father, or am I just easing a guilty conscience? What exactly am I doing? But if we'll remember, it's not like before the Mishkan that no sin could be forgiven. That's a long time period. It's not as if before the Mishkan was constructed, there were no offerings of thanksgiving or there were no guilt offerings. It's not as if those things didn't already exist and the relationships didn't already exist. But again, the sacrificial system, it brings ritual, something you can depend upon, into the picture so that what already was, forgiveness of sin, thanksgiving, guilt offerings, and so forth, those could actually be performed in a more ritualistic manner. And Hebrews 10:11 reminds us of this. Every priest stands daily ministering and offering time after time the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. So it's not the animal itself that takes away the sin. It's the relationship. It's a symbol of the relationship between you and your Father. And you're saying, you know what whatever my reason is for bringing, whether it's a peace offering, whether it's a thank offering, whether it's a sin offering, a guilt offering, a vow that you're paying, whether you're bringing tithes, they each can represent different transactions of affection. But the product itself is not what is affecting the transaction. What is affecting the transaction is between your heart and the Father's. Because even the act of writing that check in a modern time or selecting a lamb from the flock in ancient times, you had to understand that money or that lamb was already his. You were taking out of his hand in order to give back to him. And what does that tell the Father? What is he doing? He's being modest. He's allowing you to do this. Remember, he's great. He's infinite. Like he says, what can we give to you? Everything even came from you. You even created this. And so what can I give back to you? I can give you my heart and give back to you what's already in your hand. And that's when the Father's heart's going to melt. Even though it was his to begin with, you gave it back to him. You freely and out of free will did it. So the sacrifice really is only the evidence of a transaction that should have already taken place. This transaction needed to have already occurred in the heart in order for him to even lower his hand to take the coin that's already his, or the lamb that's already his. This heart downsizing has to take place. And it has to be love that has motivated this desire to maintain the relationship. If he's humbling himself to even receive what's already his, and in so doing, he's saving our dignity, he's saving our honor. The one who's offering back to him animals, grains, prayers, money, he has made himself a small olive even to receive back something so small. But see, we also have to humble ourselves in love to give him back what is his. It would only be an uninstructed mind, an impure mind, a twisted mind, a backsliding mind or heart that could ever think a sacrifice was somehow affecting this transaction. It's the outward token of an inward transaction. You can take as many lambs or bulls as you want, and it's never going to get rid of your guilt if you have not done that repentance of the heart. So the prophet is the one to provoke us into thinking about these transactions that we make that seem to be ritualistic. It's our job to make sure they're not just ritualistic. And the role of the priest is to help us also, like the prophet, to make sure they don't become ritualistic. But the priest's role is a little bit different. There's a prophetic voice in Scripture. We hear that in the prophets. And there's a wisdom voice. Remember, it was King who even writes Mishle, the Proverbs. But there's also a priestly voice. And if you're looking to say, well, how do I know which voice is speaking? I'm reading this passage of Scripture. How do I know which voice is speaking? Well, obviously, like everything else, there's going to be overlap. But if you start to see phrases like, or word separated, or phrases that mean separated or separation, then you're likely hearing the priestly voice. Because the creation was a series of separations, and it had to be maintained with those boundaries by the priesthood of the garden. And Sachs comments on this. He says, unlike the prophet and the king, the priest does not live in the world of every day. He is the guardian of space and time, of sacred space and time. In the terms of the Mishkan and the Mikdash, sacred space. In terms of the feasts and the Sabbaths, the sacred time. So in a sense, even though he lives within history, he lives outside of it. He's not really trying to make history. He's not really trying to comment on history. He's doing his job in spite of history. And that's why it's so important to recognize your role as a royal priesthood, because you're not really trying to make history. You're not really trying to comment on history, even though some of both of these roles are part of your life. Prophet and king, those are still part of your life. But as a royal priesthood, your job is to do what you do every day and still manage to be that guardian of sacred space and time, which is holiness. And so that's how you can tell if you're reading something coming from a priestly voice. The king's voice will often be in the wisdom literature, and the prophet, you kind of know, you can see a rebuke when you read it. And a lot of times those will overlap because both of those roles are very much concerned with generational history. The priest is just going to keep working and maintaining holy boundaries. And this is why they say that Adonai reveals himself in the word typically in three ways: through acts of creation, acts of redemption, and revelations of himself. And so a lot of times to us, it might feel as though scripture is disjointed, when actually he's putting together these different voices and these different ways of revealing himself. And in some cases, we'll see in the word, sometimes the priestly voice might clash up against the kingly voice. And we can think of specific incidents where this happens, such as, remember, David, who has this kingly voice, this royal voice. The other king is chasing him, and so he goes into the Mishkan, and then the high priest gives him the sacred bread. He gives him the bread of faces to eat because he's hungry. It's practical. You know, for the priest, he's going to relinquish the sacred bread over to the kingly voice in that situation. Why? Because there's an imperative within the commandments that you are to live in them, not to die in them. But when we read a case like that, most often we're going to get puzzled. Like, now, how did they decide that was okay? I mean, was that a violation? Or was this a light and heavy? What exactly is happening here? So I wanted to put another tool in your toolbox this week. You go to the library and you see this sign on the door. The library is closed today. You say, oh man, the library is closed today. Well, that's it. The library is not going to be open today. But then you look down a little farther and you see this sign. The library is open today. You say, what is wrong with these people? How can the library be closed today and the library be open today? That's just dumb. Why would they put these two signs on the door when clearly they... You okay, babe? Okay. Drink. Bulldogs. Okay, so we've got two contradictory messages, the same library. How do we reconcile two different messages? Well, we keep looking, and that's what you have to do with scripture. You just have to keep looking. There might be another message that will help you reconcile the two. Or in our case, there might be an added dimension of what we're reading that helps us understand what we're seeing. This is a more simple example, because if I look down, I can actually answer the question, is the library open or closed, with yes. Because now I see this message. The library is closed today until noon. The library is open today from noon until 9 p.m. So both statements were actually true, but written from different perspectives, because maybe the janitor wanted you to know that the library is closed today until noon to clean the carpets. But then maybe the librarian came along and says, oh, well, they don't need to believe that the library is closed all day. Let me put the hours when we're actually open so that they'll know when to come. And so if you put together the janitor statement with the librarian statement, they're both simultaneously true. But we have to have the patience to keep looking for the text in scripture, or to keep learning so that we can engage this added dimension of what scripture's trying to tell us, because it might tell us one thing in a priestly voice, another thing in a kingly voice, another thing in a prophetic voice. And then we have to reconcile all those voices, which is not always easy. Now, here's another one that Viktor Frankl uses. If you've never read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, it's worth it. If you like philosophy in the least little bit, which my doctorate's in philosophy. I know that's crazy. But it's not a difficult book to read. It's a deep book. It's not very big. But coming out of the Holocaust, he just has some astounding insights into the way the human being functions. And so he uses this puzzle to explain puzzles in a text when we're not exactly getting, why do these seem to contradict? So he says a contradiction in 2 dimensions can make sense in 3. And he shows how the human mind can reconcile this. So here's the puzzle. You see 2 shapes. Both of the shadows cast by an object on a screen. You can only see the shadow, not the object. One is a rectangle, the other is circle. But there's only one object. What is it? Now, I couldn't put the pictures on there without a copyright violation. But think of these 2 shapes, a rectangle and a circle. And you're seeing 2 different things here. Or you believe you're seeing 2 different things. But he's telling you there's only one object that you're seeing. What is the object? And Paul kind of teaches us this concept in 1 Corinthians 13:12. He says, for now we see in a mirror dimly. Like Viktor Frankl saying, these are shadows cast by an object on a screen. And Paul says, we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I also have been fully known. So he's saying the Father sees everything, but he has to reveal things to us in phases and in different voices and in different chronologies. And so this puzzle, if we go, let's see, a couple other examples before I give you the solution to the puzzle. It says, if we add the 3rd dimension, the contradiction vanishes. And that's why I'll ask questions like, is the menorah, does it represent the 7 churches or the 7 spirits of Adonai? And you've been trained to say yes, because you've studied enough to say, oh yes, both statements are true in Revelation. Or we can ask, is the description of the creation linear and chronological? Or is it circular? Like Genesis 1 versus Genesis 2. Well, it's not really a verses. It's a 1 and a 2. And that's what Frankel says. What looks like a contradiction can sometimes be resolved by simply adding a dimension, and that applies to the Torah, both as a text and a way of life. And so that's what it was. It was a cylinder. If you're just seeing the shadow of it, it will look both, depending on your perspective, like a rectangle or like a circle. But when you put it back into that three-dimensional shape that it actually is, then you say, oh, that's a cylinder. Yeah, I see why from one perspective it looked like a rectangle, but from a different perspective it looked like a circle. And that's the way we attack these texts that appear to be contradictory. And that's often what the atheist or the agnostic fails to do when they arrive at their conclusions based on cherry picking certain scriptures. They never continue through that process of modesty and making themselves small in order to find the reconciliation of the priestly voice and the kingly voice and the prophetic voice. So there's the menorah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And there's the menorah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We had linear and we have circular. So yes, both are true. Each is trying to reveal to you something from a little bit different perspective. But you can learn about the priesthood by reading both Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. So we'll go on. There's an irony to learning about priesthood today because ritual just does not fare well with modern society. They consider it the vestiges of a bygone era. Just doesn't fit the modern reality. So yes, there is some irony there. Ritual is actually come to be seen as the realm of myth, magic, paganism, or, and we get this a lot. If you're in Hebrew roots anytime at all, or Messianic Judaism anytime at all, you're going to run into these truth-only crowds. And I say truth only with the air quotes because it's the truth they believe they have found because they have not continued to read in some cases to reconcile things. But they actually see ritual as the dead ends of our faith, that we need to trim that off so that we can be living a sincere truth. So if they come in your house and you light 2 candles for Shabbat, that's a dead end. That's a paganism. That's a ritual. You need to get rid of that. That's horrible. But I'm getting some feedback from somebody there. If you can check your mute buttons. So you have to almost wonder if they ever read the book of Vayikra. At any rate, let's look at Moses. He was a prophet. There was never another prophet like him until Yeshua came. But his leadership only lasted a lifetime. His sons really are insignificant in terms of the narrative. It's Aaron's leadership that persists. And the descendants of Aaron are still out there today. In a royal family, only one king can rule at a time. So you might have many members of a royal family, but only one is going to be able to rule. But in a priesthood, all can serve if there's no physical or relational disqualification. There's no genealogical inheritance of a prophet. So in that respect, the priesthood is special. It is handed down genealogically, but in terms of a kingdom of priests, we don't have to worry about the genealogy because we're all descended from Abraham. That's what qualifies us to be that chosen race, that royal priesthood. So in effect, in functioning in a royal priesthood, we are incorporating aspects of royalty, and we are incorporating aspects of the prophet. And there's actually a pattern, there's an interesting pattern. I know some of you have already picked up on this, but I'll point it out to those of you who haven't. Aaron married Elisheva, the daughter of Aminadab, the sister of Nachshon, and she bore him Nadab and Avihu, Eleazar and Itamar. That's in Exodus 6:23. But we know that Elisheva was of the tribe of Judah. Numbers 1:7 tells us that. That Nachshon was from the tribe of Judah. So there was an intermarriage in this first priestly couple. So basically, the sons of Aharon, the priesthood, were half Jewish. There's an irony there. And through history, as the scholars have gone through the genealogies and so forth, what they realize is there seems to have been a pattern of intermarriage between the Kohanim, the Levites, and those from the tribe of Judah. And one way they can tell that is they'll look in the Gospel of Luke, and in certain tribes, there's a pattern of names. There's several variations on Mattathias, Matthias, and so forth. And these are generally associated with Levites. And they say in this Luke account, especially as, I don't know why I put, that was from a different source that I read, so I should have been more careful there. In the Luke account, there's a lot of these Matthew type names and Levitical names in the male line, but they also note that historically there seemed to be in the genealogies a lot of Levitical female names. And those do tend to pop up in the Luke account, not necessarily in the genealogy, but in Yeshua's relationships and family and so forth. But the Matthew genealogy is generally understood to be the lineage of Joseph, but the Luke account is considered to be the lineage of Mary or Miriam. And that line traces back to Nathan or Natan, who was an older brother of Solomon, who was the fourth, and I say fifth in parentheses, because remember the first child died in the relationship between Bathsheba and David. So there's an added birth up there. So as far as surviving, he's going to be the fourth son of Bathsheba. And what is really interesting is that this Natan possibly was named after the prophet. So he's of the royal line, but he's named after the prophet who was the go-between in David's relationship with Bathsheba. And so we've got the royal voice and we've got the prophetic voice in the line of Natan, but there appears to be not just previously in a Jewish, a daughter of Judah marrying into the sons of Levi, but as we go down through the more, what we would say is the modern history leading up to the first century, we also have apparently lots of Levitical women marrying into the tribe of Judah. And so how does that affect qualification? We don't want to go there. You know, they had their own ways of meeting selection criteria in terms of the priestly service. But there is a definite, the point is there's a definite pattern of intermarriage going all the way back to the first couple. And so this line of Natan or Nathan, look at the similarities here in the names. Elisheba was the wife of Aaron. She was from the tribe of Judah. And then David marries a woman who has two names. And you can see why it would be easy. Sometimes we get, like if you have a man named Henry, some people might call him Hank. We do that with names. And in this case, it's based on a letter. Sometimes she's called Bathsheba, with the Sheva being spelled with a Vait, Bathsheba, which means daughter of oath or daughter of seven. Sometimes she's called Bathshua. And you can see why. There's a vav in that spelling. A vav can have a vowel sound, like the u, shu, ah. But without that little point in there, it would be Bathsheba. Right? So it's kind of a play on the letters there. Bathshua means daughter of wealth. Right? So again, we can see the idea of this priestly voice, this daughter of wealth. We can see a daughter of oath and a daughter of seven. Daughter of seven, it would make you think of a priesthood, the priesthood of the garden we've got the 7 days of creation. But a daughter of oath, that would make you think of prophecy, when people take an oath. And the prophets address that topic repeatedly. So there's like overlap in the voices, even in her names. And so if we spring forward to the book of Luke, which is speaking again about these early days of Miriam's pregnancy. And Elisheva, her name is Elizabeth Elisheva in Hebrew, just like Aaron's wife. So in Luke 1:5, it says, in the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zacharias of the division of Abiah, and he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron. And her name was Elisheva. So ironically there, we got a royal voice, the king of Judea, and we've got the priestly voice, not just Zechariah in his priestly division, but he's married to a wife from the daughters of Aaron. And her name is Elizabeth. Well, again, Elisheva means my God has sworn. And this is true of Aaron's wife. She's from Judah. But yet, we're talking about an Elisheva now who is a daughter of Aaron. Somehow, and scripture does not tell us how, but we are told that Mary, or Miriam, Yeshua's mother, is a relative of this priestly couple. So is she from the tribe of Judah, or is she from the tribe of Levi? The answer here might be yes, because of this pattern that we have going all the way back to the original Aaron, where he marries a woman from the tribe of Judah, merging the priestly voice again with that royal voice. And we get the idea of a royal priesthood. So, like I said, based on the Levitical names, there's 6 forms of Mattathias in Miriam's genealogy, and those are typically considered Levitical names, which tells us there were probably Levitical women stretching back from the 1st century, marrying into this Davidic line of Nathan, another son, again of David, but a brother to Solomon. However, the line of Solomon was disqualified to sit on the throne, right? Jeremiah 22:30 says, "Thus says the Lord, write this man down as childless, a man who will not prosper in his days, for no man of his descendants will prosper, sitting on the throne of David or ruling again in Judah." That disqualified the line of Solomon from any more taking the throne of Judah. However, there were other sons of David, Nathan or Natan being one of them, another son of Bathsheba or Bathshua. So based on that lineage that's given of Miriam, and remember that's really the lineage that counts, because on Joseph's side, we're talking about more of an adoption. Through his adopted lineage, Yeshua would have been qualified to sit on the throne. But would he? There's a hitch. It was disqualified. So in two ways, having Joseph's lineage tells us that Yeshua was not going to be a king based on his father, because that line is disqualified from sitting on the throne, and that's not his natural father. But it's listed, and there's a particular turn of phrase in that lineage that we don't have time to chase down now, but it kind of tells you that something out of the way happened here. And even though they're giving you this lineage, it doesn't really pertain to the child that was born from this marriage, right? That she was impregnated, but not necessarily by the man of this lineage. But if we look at his mother's lineage, he will be qualified to ascend to the throne of Israel, which at that point in the first century has been usurped by the descendants of Matthias, one of the Maccabees. Remember all the stories of the Maccabees? They had this glory days where they defeated the Greeks. And then, not really trusting the royal line, they usurped the throne, ruling both as kings and priests. Eventually, that's going to fall to Roman appointees, because remember, history marches on. So the descendants of Natan, they're obscure, but they're qualified. They're still qualified to sit on the throne. The people know this. And this family of descendants of Natan lived in the exact region of Galilee where Yeshua grew up. We know this historically because there are Roman records. And the Romans were checking on this family well into the 2nd century AD. Even the Gospel of Mark mentions other relatives that were apparently from that area. And some of them were put to death by the Romans out of fear that they would have messianic, rebellious aspirations. Some were literally taken to Rome and interrogated to find out what they were all about. And the report that was given is, well, we talked to them and they're nothing but a bunch of peasants. You know, they definitely don't have any messianic tendencies. They definitely don't have any aspirations to a royal throne. Just let them go back and keep digging in the dirt. But in a century, the first century, where there's lots of messiahs trying to rise up, Yeshua would have been of a particular interest to the Herods, to the dynasty of the Herods. Number one, because they are not qualified to sit on the throne of Judah. They are evil, murderers. And so you can see why when these wise men from the east come looking for the Messiah, the King of the Jews, why Herod's ears would have pricked up, because he knows there are qualified people in Judah at this time who could sit on the throne. And you can see why he would wipe out the children of Bethlehem, the baby boys, just in case there was one with some, had been designated as a future king of Judah. Well, just in case, let's get rid of them. Because we often don't even think about the process that people would go through to say, well, is this person qualified to sit on the throne? If we're going to have an uprising, if we're going to kick the Romans out like we kicked out the Greeks, who's qualified to sit on this throne and rectify the problem of these descendants of the Maccabees, twisting the priesthood, all sorts of problems with the priesthood and the throne in the first century. And so Yeshua apparently has, again, blood from both Judah and Levi through his mother. That appears to be the case. But when we think of Elisheva or Bat-sheva, Sheva is both an oath and it can mean 7. And so if it's the word of creation, we can also see that oath is embedded in the creation week, in the sevens. It's the play on the word there. So we've got a precedent. If we look back in the garden, there's a precedent of kingship and there's a precedent of priesthood. And Jewish tradition tells us that Adam was the first king of Israel, that Israel was actually present in the garden in a prophetic way. And we looked at the rivers of Eden and all the stuff that was there, and we can see, yes, there's definitely all the signs of a priesthood, maybe the royal part less evident, but the idea that they're given rulership over the garden, that's really all you need to understand that there's a royal aspect to that priesthood in the garden. And maybe this is why this Mishkan so closely resembled the creation. And so I made here some bullet points to think about. If we look at the priesthood of the garden, we can see how it would relate to the priestly service, not just as priests of Israel, but also as priests to Israel. Because in the garden, they could pass between realms. Remember, there's boundaries. We see the priest doing that. He can go from the place of the menorah and the bread of faces, then he can go back into the outer courts. Certain days, he can go into the Holy of Holies. He can pass through realms much more freely than the average person. He has this genetic qualification for service, regardless of whether there is a Mishkan or a Mikdash. He's entitled to the holies of the people. He's a judge of spiritual illness. He's going to teach the purity laws that are unique to the tribes of Israel. He's going to have to establish the boundaries that will stop the spread of Hamas or violence. We see that in the natural realm today. Governments have put boundaries in place so that the plague will not be spread. Well, in the spiritual realm, if you don't set the boundaries of the mitzvot, especially concerning the purity laws, you can expect violence to spread. That seems to be a byproduct of no boundaries. And remember what we said in the Shabbat teaching, what follows the white horse of the plague, it's the red horse of the sword. Because people become afraid. When people become afraid, they tend toward violence. And they start trying to take things before you take it from me. Very animalistic. The priest teaches and observes purity laws that allow us to enter the holy space that we made for God as a Mishkan. And we may have made the space of the Mishkan, but if we fall into a condition of impurity, it's going to prevent us from going back in until that impurity is resolved. Same thing with the garden. If we don't observe the boundaries, it might be there for us to be in the divine presence, but impurity will prevent us from entering until that impurity is resolved through the commandments. That's why we have commandments, so that we can resolve the impurities. The priest had to remain perpetually in a consciousness of life. Remember, at the center of the garden is the tree of life. Well, a priest has to stay away from anything that might have a form of death, decay, disease, mortality, because he's supposed to live in a consciousness of the infinity of the garden. And he's a priest to Israel as Israel is a priest to humanity. And so boundaries, we can see whether we're looking at the priesthood of the garden or the priesthood of Israel or the priesthood of the priest to Israel. They're all going to have unique, in common, setting boundaries, guarding the boundaries so that the holy spaces are preserved. And we can see this. What should Adam and Eve have been doing as both rulers and priests in the garden? They should have been guarding against immorality in that holy space. And as priests, they should have been performing avodah, service in that holy space, guarding and working, distinguishing, managing levels of holiness as they move about that space, not only during the 6 days of work, but also on Shabbat. So they had two violations, one of their relationship with Elohim and one of their relationship to one another. You notice how they broke at the same time? Once they broke that closeness of the presence with Elohim, their closeness to one another, we start saying things like the woman you gave me, as if she's not part of him, and if she is not him, when they're one. So if one relationship breaks, it's a symptom that the other one is also broken as well. So the role of the king is basically to regulate this universal morality. It's not the king's job to administrate the minute laws of purity. The king wants to regulate how human beings relate to one another. They're going to administrate this through their courts, through wisdom literature, but it's the priest in particular who is going to have to supervise and manage these boundaries of holiness, and that affects Israel's relationship with God. So there's two things that have to be managed: our relationship with one another, where we hear this royal voice, and then our relationship with the Holy One, which is where we hear the priestly voice. And of course, the prophet's there to challenge all of us. So we're called to this vocation that uses the role of king and priest, a royal priesthood. But even though we feel like, as we read Vayikra, there's nothing more constricting than what we could be reading. It's like, man, there's no room to wiggle. You can't make mistakes or you get killed like Nadav and Avihu. But really nothing has changed from the garden. We were created as creatures of free will, and you were free to observe the laws of holiness or not. Even if there's a priest who is genetically qualified, if he does not want to serve, he cannot be forced to serve. Even though they might give him some stripes, if he doesn't want to, you can't make him. He can make a scar in his flesh that would disqualify him. He could marry a divorcee. He could just refuse. He still has free will. So while it seems like a priest has the least amount of freedom, that's exactly the point of holiness. The priest inherits all the qualifications, yet even in that inheritance, he chooses to do the service, the avodah. The greatest gift, the greatest sacrifice a human being can give to the Father is his freedom. We're free to do our own will. We always have been. But when we sacrifice the free will that the Father gave us to begin with, and we hand that coin back to the Father, that defines a royal priest. We say, you know what? These mitzvot, right now, they feel very constricting, like there's no movement. But out of free will, out of love, out of a desire to grow closer, I'm going to give back to you my free will that you gave me. It's a surrendered return to the Father. It's that garden requirement of holiness. I'm going to put you in this garden with free will. But then it's also, as a priesthood, your job to return the affection out of free will. And if you'll read through again Psalm 50 after class is over, it's going to describe to you the difference. Talking about this rulership of morality, but then this priesthood of love. Remember, the heart of Vayikra is love. Love your neighbor. So when we have this attitude of obedience, of this surrendered free will, what we start to take on is honor, glory, immortality. See, we make ourselves small. We say, you know what? I would love to have some crab cakes right now. And I am free to eat a crab cake if I want it. He gave me free will. I can figure out where there's a crab, and I can get a recipe for a crab cake, and I can make a crab cake and eat it if I want to. But I surrender that. I'm going to make myself small. Even though on the Red Lobster commercial, it looks really tasty, I surrender that free will to go eat a crab cake. I'm making myself small. When we do that, when we take our free will and we put it back into the hand of the Father because we love him, that's when it takes on honor. That's when it takes on glory. That's when it takes on immortality. That's when we say, wow, you know what? I'm preparing for my job in the garden. This is my vocation. That's when we get the blessings of the kingdom. That's when we get the garments of glory. That's when the crowns come into play. Because it's your acts of service, obedience, how you rule over your own desire that's going to honor both the Father and your neighbor at the very same time. And that's what Exodus 28:2, he says, you shall make holy garments for Aaron, your brother, for glory and for beauty. We saw how in Revelation that the fine linen were the righteous acts of the saints. So the garments that Aaron puts on are righteous acts that eventually will be revealed to us as glory and beauty of a priesthood. So when you keep a commandment because you love the Father and you know you don't have anything else to give him back but the free will that he gave you, you're making a transaction of love. And the physical thing that you would give him, money, volunteer time, a lamb, a bull, grain, whatever it is you would give back to him, that's only a token of a transaction that's already taken place. You're not paying him back because you can't. It's all his. And that's the central message of Vayikra. If you want to engage in these rituals, you have to love freely. You have to surrender free will. You have to give the love transaction to the Father. And so here's your homework. And the homework is based on 2 Peter. Remember, both letters of Peter have to do with the themes of Vayikra. So the homework is from 2 Peter chapter 1. And I'll leave these up there for just a second, so when you go back and you rewind, that you can see the questions. And there's the first page, and there's the second page. There's 12 questions. A pool noodle. That's funny. Yes, it was a cylinder. Marie got it. I wouldn't have gotten it in a million years.
A pool noodle's a cylinder. It's just a very long one.
It's an extremely long one.
It works in the pool. I'm a Florida girl. It's all about water, right?
Yeah, I can see who has the scientific minds in the class.
What I thought about was that was neat today was all the kingly priestly